Gracias por acompañarnos en una nueva emisión de Sentados a la Mesa Podcast, un espacio creado para sentarnos contigo a la mesa y traer herramientas y soluciones para que tu familia vuelva al diseño original.
So welcome. Hello, everybody that follows us on this podcast, Sentados a la Mesa. Today we have a guest that is going to be teaching us about the history of homeschooling. And for everybody that speaks Spanish, we do have the subtitles on this interview. I'm very honored and blessed to have today with me Mr. Darren Jones. He is the Director of Group Services at HSLDA and Senior Counsel. Welcome, Darren Jones. How are you?
I am doing well today. Thanks very much for having me, Ana Maria.
Well, thank you for joining us again. So I heard you have four homeschooled children. I know our audience wants to meet you first as who you are, and then let's jump into the history of homeschooling. So tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Okay. So I was one of three kids, and I've gone to public school and private school, back to public, and then for the last couple of years, my parents decided to homeschool me. And my wife is the same. She'd been in public school and then was homeschooled for the last few years. Both of us had really good experiences with it. And so when we started having children in the early 2000s, we decided we were going to homeschool them. And it's worked well for our kids as well. We have four children, as you said, and we have graduated the first three. In fact, one of them just graduated from 12th grade this year. And we had a nice graduation ceremony put on by our state homeschool organization here in Virginia. And we have one more child. He is starting 10th grade this year. Actually, he's already started a couple online courses. And then next week we'll be kicking off with some other ones.
That's great. And I know you also like playing table games with your family. I've seen you around also in state conventions, and you're usually hanging out with the kids and the parents as well. So you are a senior counsel, but
I've
you
been
also...
able to do that here in Virginia several times.
Right, yes. So thank you, Darren, for spending this time with us. Really the intention of this time that we're going to spend together is to share about the history of homeschooling and what HSLDA does right now to protect parental rights and to instruct parents on what they can do at home and preserve their families and raise their children with the best tools available to them in homeschooling. So I know you are a master in the history of homeschooling. I will just let you get started from a very quick perspective of what you have seen so far. Where are we now and how did we start it?
Okay. So I'll take a little bit now to talk about some of the modern homeschooling movement because, of course, homeschooling's been going on a long time. But here in the United States, the modern homeschool movement really kicked off in the 1960s. And this was an era when there were a lot of parents in the United States who were looking at a very institutionalized education system and saying, we don't want that for our children. Now, these were usually led by left-wing intellectuals, like, for example, John Holt, and they were protesting all sorts of institutionalized, for example, government and military. And so when they looked at the education system, their objections were really the same. In fact, John Holt's idea was that children should be free to be educated by their own choice. Who should educate them should be the child's choice, when they educated, where they were educated. This is where the term unschooling came from. So that's kind of the kickoff in the 1960s. There was another kind of wave of homeschooling in the 1970s. This one was led by a couple, Dr. Raymond Moore and his wife, and they actually wrote a book. A lot of Parents read it and thought, this is good. That book was called Better Late Than Early, and talked about how it's good for children to just play when they are young. That a lot of learning and vital lifelong lessons can be learned through play. And then you start teaching them when they're a little bit older, instead of making them go to school at 5 years old and sit in a classroom all day. Dr. Moore was a Seventh-day Adventist, and because of that, he had a very holistic view of education. It wasn't just books. It wasn't just sitting down learning. He was very big on, part of homeschooling is actually community service, and part of it is physical education, and you need to involve the whole child. So it was still somewhat centered on the child's needs, but it was more from a holistic health part.
Right.
And then another thing started happening in the 1970s. A whole bunch of churches started little Christian schools because parents were getting dissatisfied with the direction that the public schools were going. And so churches would start up these Christian schools. And then in the 1980s, quite a few of those schools shut down because they ran out of money. I mean, running a private school is expensive. And so now those parents who had their kids in Christian schools started looking for other options. And they probably wouldn't have listened to John Holt, because these were more conservative Christian parents, but they were listening to Dr. Raymond Moore. In fact, he was on a radio broadcast in the very early 80s with Dr. James Dobson of Focus on the Family, talking about homeschooling. And a number of parents heard that and thought, that sounds good for my kids and for my family. And so a lot of people think that's really where modern homeschooling started up. Actually, that was kind of the second or third wave of homeschooling by that point.
Okay, well, thank you for pointing that out. So,
Yes.
after John Holt, we have like this kind of revolution almost,
Yes.
where parents are starting to explore home education. But I also know, and I have read, that the Puritans, when they came here to the United States, were homeschoolers. So sometimes I just say, well, this was the original way of educating. It's actually how people were raising their children when this country began in that way. And then the proposal of having independent institutions or private schools came after that original model. So that parents that hear us in this interview, it's important to know that there was always like an original model of educating the next generation. And then as history has gone by, there has been other proposals. And here we are in 2024, today, going back to what is original, many families shifting into that way of raising children where parents are connected to their children. And the main education, and I will say that holistic education that you mentioned, it's happening again at this time in history. So it's good to see that we're coming back to the beginning again. And there's always the opportunity to going back to this way of educating. And that's what we do here through this podcast, to not only raise awareness, but to show parents how to do this. So you were mentioning, going back to history, you were sharing, Darren, that originally there were private Christian schools, but then that was too expensive. So people were starting looking on other ways. I'm assuming at some point groups and co-ops appeared in this story. Can you point us out in that direction? Where did these groups appear after they closed those private Christian schools?
Sure. So my experience is somewhat a good example of how this occurred. So I was in a private school for my middle school years, and then went back to a public school for a couple of years. And then, as I said, my parents decided that they were going to homeschool. I thought this was a marvelous idea. I was all for it. In fact, they had originally thought it was just going to be my younger sister. And then I said, oh no, this sounds good. I want to. And one of the things that mom and dad did, because of course homeschooling was new to them, they decided they didn't want it to just be our family doing it 5 days a week at home. They wanted interaction with other homeschool families. And so that first year of homeschooling, they got together with 6 or 7 other families in our church and said, how about if we get together every Monday and Wednesday afternoon and we'll kind of rotate. We'll do things all together. We had, I think, 13 or 14 students that first year. And there were parents teaching geography classes, and there were parents teaching cooking, and one of the grandparents was really good at math, so he took the 4 of us who were in high school and taking algebra and taught us algebra and answered our questions about that. After 1 year, they decided 2 afternoons a week is kind of intense, especially since some families were having to travel 45 minutes or so, and so they went to 1 afternoon a week. Because the parents are cooperating to teach in a situation like this, usually that's what we refer to as a homeschool co-op.
Okay.
Now, this group also, though, had what is often called a support group, and that was once a month, the parents would get together without the kids and just spend time praying for each other and talking about how is homeschooling going for you. And so you had activities for the kids, that's kind of the homeschool co-op, and then you had prayer and support for the parents, that's more what's often called a support group. It was the same families, but it was different things happening. But both of them were to support the parents teaching their kids, and that's what homeschooling is all about. Yes, you get help from other places. We actually did a course where we rented VHS tapes of a course through Abeka Books down in Florida, because of course no internet yet. But it was parents teaching their kids at home for all of us, and it worked out really well.
It was community collaboration, like you said. It's and still is in modern times for those newcomers into homeschooling. This is a community, and we always say it's impossible to do it on our own. Even if we have tutors or even if we go to conferences, having that community, that support on a weekly basis helps both the parent and the child. And I hear from many parents, particularly the Hispanic parents shifting into homeschooling, that they're looking for these kind of groups. They are understanding that they need the support and that they cannot do this by themselves. So right now, how many co-ops are there in the U.S. approximately that you know of, Darren?
There are thousands. We have somewhere around 2,000, I think, listed on our website at HSLDA.org. But that's probably just some percentage of what's out there. But there are enough that often you can find a group near you, or else there are actually a lot of homeschool support groups now that operate online. And so if you have prayer requests, or maybe you can have a Zoom meeting with several moms about how are you dealing with this and can you support me in that? Like you say, community. And that community can look different from group to group and from family to family. Our family has been homeschooling for I think 17 years now. And sometimes we have done in-person co-ops where kids go and take a class once a week. And sometimes we have done just kind of a homeschool hangout day. There's a local youth development center you can rent for a day. There are coffee shops that are welcome to groups of teenagers coming in and hang out for a couple hours with other homeschooled teens. The local library in our area is big on helping homeschoolers. They often have weekly meetings, they have science fairs for homeschoolers, they have game nights, and most of the kids who are coming there are homeschool students. There's lots out there, and like you said, it's community, because yes, I'm a homeschool advocate, I want to see parents teaching their kids, but I don't want to see them just hiding in their house all the time. Homeschooling really is good in community.
Yeah, I think it's unbearable even to just do it inside your house, not going out and talking to people, and listening also to other parents, because I think we're all on the same boat. We just experience it differently, but we're always in need of something. It depends on each family's need, but as you build that community, that support system, it facilitates all this learning process. It alleviates the weight on the parents. And I think the community grows this way when you come together and not just stay at home. I think the name homeschooling sometimes narrows it down to a home-based education, but in reality, it's a world education. You're educating everywhere. You're breaking the mold and the walls and going into these co-ops or support groups. It's a proof that it doesn't need to happen at home uniquely. It happens in many areas at different times with different people. So that myth that we are unsocialized or that we're keeping the kids at home it's absolutely false. It's a myth. So thank you for bringing that out in such a detailed way, because homeschooling is fun. It's really freeing. If I think of homeschooling, to me equals freedom, and with freedom comes responsibility. And I think that's one of the things that also parents need to understand in our community, is that right now we're talking about parental rights. You see that a lot on social media, but with rights also comes responsibility. So it's kind of both ways. We just don't enjoy the freedom without having some responsibility towards that. So thank you for telling us about that. Let's continue a little bit with the history. Where are we now?
Sure.
What are you seeing from HSLDA and from your area of work? We are seeing growth, and I know you agree on that. But
Yes.
what do you see happening with that growth? With growth, many things happen.
So we left off in the 1980s, which was when Homeschool Legal Defense Association started up, because homeschooling still wasn't legal in a lot of places. But over the next 40 years, what we see is this tendency for families to try homeschooling, and then other families see, oh, that's working well for you. And then they see, like in the late 90s, you start having kids graduate and moving into jobs and getting into the military and entering college, and now more people are saying, oh yes, homeschooling worked for that student and that family. And then in the mid 2000s, we start getting families thinking about, okay, well, I'll send this child to public school, but this one would probably do better at home. And so you often kind of get a mixing and a matching. And then starting maybe somewhere in the early 20-teens, there's a real big growth in those homeschool groups that we talked about, and they start becoming sometimes more professional. So instead of like when it was me, parents and grandparents doing almost all of the teaching and mostly volunteer, now you have groups who are saying, well, you know, there's this college professor over here who wants to do a little on the side, and we'll teach some advanced science classes to homeschoolers at this church on Wednesdays. And you have, well, this homeschool mom has graduated her kids and she's really good at literature, and so there are going to be some book clubs on Monday and Wednesday at the church here. And so you go to this church on Wednesday and there may be 350 kids there, all taking classes. Most of them are paid. And if you come back on Thursday, you may see another 200 kids, and some of them will be the same from Wednesday, and some of them are new ones. And so you get homeschooling that's kind of looking a bit more like private school sometimes in some contexts.
Right.
And then we hit 2020. And with the shutdown of the public schools, a lot of parents now saw homeschooling as an option. For some of them, it was they didn't like what the public school was offering online. For some of them, it was, you know what, I see what the public school is offering online and it's okay, but I'll bet I can do better than that. And for some of them, it was, this is not working for my child, but my neighbor has been homeschooling, and so she's going to be teaching the 3 families around here. And so you start hearing about pods. And this kind of coordinated with a movement that's been going on for, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so now, the idea of micro schools, that you have small, more flexible private schools that have a lot of parental involvement, but usually they aren't run by a parent. Often it's a teacher or an entrepreneur who has interesting ideas for how to educate kids. And so now what we're seeing in 2024 is there are so many options for parents. You absolutely can do what my parents did of filing some sort of notice of intent, depending on what your state is. And that's actually a lot of our job here at HSLDA is trying to convince local districts the parents know what they're doing when they file the paperwork and you guys don't know the law. But, then most of the instruction goes on at home. That's what my wife and I have chosen to do with our kids. Most of the stuff that they're doing, they take a couple online classes, but most of it's at home. And sometimes we do some co-op and outside. Or maybe you decide, well, that works for some families, but we're actually going to send our kids to co-op on Monday and Thursday all day from 9 to 4 in the afternoon. And they will do work there and then they'll bring it home and work on it Tuesday and Wednesday and Friday. Depending on the state law, that might still be homeschooling under the law.
I was going to ask,
is
that still homeschooling?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No,
I was
that's
going to
fine.
ask precisely that.
Yes, so this is one where every state has a different law for homeschooling. And there are some states like here in Virginia where there's 3 different options, well, kind of 4 for doing it. But it's a fairly, you have public school here, you have private school here, and then you have homeschool here. There are a couple different ways of doing homeschool. But the private school law actually is flexible enough that you could kind of do a hybrid program here and call it either private school or homeschool, depending on how you count attendance, like, a kid being in attendance at school. There are some states like North Carolina where you can have 2 families do it together full time. So, I send my kids over there Monday through Friday, and my neighbor is teaching them. That's homeschooling in North Carolina. 3 families, it's not. Now it's a private school. Washington and New York are both quite flexible as long as the hybrid or co-op or whatever you're calling it is operating only 2 days a week, maybe even 2.5 days a week. But as soon as it's 3 days a week and the parents are doing less than half, well, then there's issues. And the New York Department of Education and the Washington Education Department both have real issues with that and say, oh no, that's an illegal private school.
Right.
Whether it is or not, you could talk to a lawyer about it. But your question of, is that hybrid program there still homeschooling? Well, there are some states that define homeschooling and there are some that don't. And so I'm going to be like every lawyer everywhere and say, it depends.
It depends. Okay, family,
Yes.
so now you've heard, and that brings us to the topic of what HSLDA does on a weekly basis. And it has to do with what you're saying, Darren, because every state is different. But you also have a branch that oversees what's happening in the homeschooling movement worldwide. So there's layers to this movement. So we're talking right now about the history of home education in the United States, but there's also a history happening worldwide, particularly the Hispanic community. We're seeing, massive growth, and I read about the stories in our Latin American countries and how they are in the process of doing what the United States did 40 years ago, which is legalizing this in all 50 states. So it's encouraging to see, and we have a precedent or a history where we can stand and learn from that and encourage our countries to keep on striving for their parental rights and for their freedom, truly. So tell us a little bit about HSLDA for those that don't know about you, and also how can they contact you if they're not local but they are outside of the country. How can they reach you and get some answers?
Sure. So going back to the early 1980s, remember I mentioned that Dr. Moore was on that radio broadcast? Well, 2 people who heard him were lawyers named Mike. There was a Mike Ferris who lived in Washington at the time and Mike Smith who was in California. Both of them found out that homeschooling existed and sounded like it would be a good idea for their families.
Right.
But in California, it really was questionable whether it was legal. There were actually some court cases from the mid-20th century that said it wasn't legal unless you were a certified teacher. And so Mike Ferris and Mike Smith got together and had this idea of, let's get lawyers who know about homeschooling. And people can join as members, and then if they have questions, or if their school tries to shut them down, like happened in a number of states, then we can actually go to court and defend the families. So in 1983, that's how HSLDA started. And all through the 80s and early 90s, the fight was, is homeschooling legal? So, for example, when I was being homeschooled in New Hampshire, 1989, my parents had to ask permission from our local school board before they could homeschool. And they actually got denied the first time they asked. And so then the fight during the up to the mid-90s or so was, let's make sure it's legal without having to jump through all these hoops. So part of what I got to do when I was being homeschooled was I testified in front of the New Hampshire legislature about a new bill that would make it so that now you didn't ask permission, you simply notified the school district, I'm going to homeschool.
Right. So
which
just
made
for
it a
the
lot
reference
simpler.
or for the record for people that are listening, there was a time where it was illegal in many states and parents have to stand up for their rights. And that's where it gets very interesting how everything started with parents. It always calls my attention to see that even HSLDA began with two lawyers, but they were parents as well, realizing they had this right and claiming it, and going and making the work. I even heard the story of moms that were going to be put on jail because they were homeschooling. So here's a very important part of the history of home education that everybody should know, that there are 40 years of history where we are standing here in the United States, and thankfully these courageous people that came before us were able to legalize this way of education in the United States. But now our countries, Latin American countries, are in that fight and in that journey of doing almost the same and standing and claiming I will say their legitimate rights, because as parents, it's God who gives us our children. So we are called to decide how we want to educate them. So thank you for mentioning Mike Ferris and Mike Smith, whom I had the blessing to meet when I came to HSLDA Leaders Conference in 2021. And then we saw how he started, and we learned how he started HSLDA, which is really, really touching. And people should know that all this movement began at home with professional parents, and history has been written by parents. So truly the power is in the parents at home. So let's continue that. I just wanted to make that note for our listeners.
So homeschooling by the mid-90s was legal. And in fact, you didn't have to be a certified teacher to do it anymore. There were 3 holdout states where you had to be a certified teacher. Eventually, each of them changed their law. HSLDA was instrumental in that one, for example, in Michigan, where we actually won a court case that said, no, if you're a religious parent homeschooling, you don't have to be a certified teacher. And then we were able to help get the law changed so it extended to even parents who weren't religious. They didn't have to be a certified teacher. So by the end of the 90s, it was legal, but not generally accepted. That's been really the fight for the last 20 years or so, is working with colleges to make sure the homeschool graduates aren't discriminated against. I'm actually fighting a college down in Texas right now on that issue, because they're not wanting to let homeschool graduates in at the same level as public school graduates. It's working with businesses to recognize that, yes, a homeschool diploma is a high school diploma. A lot of our job right now, though, is educating parents, because, of course, we live in a much more mobile society than we used to. Parents moving from state to state, and so we have to tell them, here's what the laws are in this state, here's how you comply with them over here. Everywhere, it's legal, but there are rules in a lot of states about what you have to do. And then one of
Right.
the most important things we're constantly having to do is state legislatures keep introducing bills to regulate homeschooling, and so we have to fight those off. Georgia came up with a horrible one back about 10 or 15 years ago, where it looked like they had cobbled together the worst parts of all the homeschool laws across the country and said, here, let's do this. Thankfully, we were able to get that one defeated. Ohio, we've had to fight there to keep homeschooling free. And in fact, we were able just last year to get a bill through the legislature that made homeschooling in Ohio a lot freer than it had been. But that was after years of fighting for homeschool's rights to be free. So that's a lot of what HSLDA does now. It is free. We want to keep it free. And so that's a lot of my job. So you
Right.
introduced me at the beginning as far as the senior counsel and director of group services. I work with homeschool groups all across the country who are helping these homeschool parents, especially the ones who are new to it, to say, yes, I can do this. And
Right.
I love it. I talk with fascinating group leaders all the time, and the ideas that they have and the passion they have, like you said, homeschooling is a parent-driven thing. A lot of these groups I've talked to, they are run by homeschool parents who have really neat ideas for how to help other families educate their own children.
Yes, and thank you, HSLDA, for what you do. I know it's crucial, particularly at this time of history where you get that legislation being trying to be pushed on people so that they can regulate something that it has always been our right. So thank you for what you do on a daily basis, Darren. And so that you know, we're always also working on opening our own group here at Transition Ed here in South Florida. So we will be sharing more about that happening next year. We're exploring South Florida, where there's a huge need for parents to really find that support system because they're shifting to homeschooling. So we are excited to see the growth, but we know that with growth, there's a lot of education that needs to happen, like you just said. So please, to everybody that is listening to us, share this podcast, listen to it again, learn the history of this movement, connect with the people that have been there before. Join HSLDA for sure. They have a membership, and that membership is a blessing too. You get education out of that as well, and you get the benefit of talking to people like Darren and many other senior counsels at HSLDA that can point you to the right direction. Any closing words, Darren, for people that are listening to us, particularly the Hispanic community?
Yes. So again, using my own experience as an example, when I was started to be homeschooled, I was going into grade 11, and I went to a homeschool convention in New Hampshire, and one of the big questions in 1989 was, can homeschool graduates actually get into college? The answer turned out to be yes. Some easier than others. That's been a fight, through the 90s, basically. And then I went and I had the opportunity to speak up in Canada, in Quebec, in about 2003 or 4, and they were about 10 or 15 years behind the US kind of in the growth of homeschooling. And the question there in Quebec was, can homeschool graduates actually get into university? And the answer in Canada has turned out to be yes. And there are lots of homeschool parents up in Canada. I got to meet with some Hispanic homeschool leaders from Latin American countries back about a year or so ago. And I found one of the major questions there is, can homeschool graduates actually get into universities? And so these countries are following along, and it's my hope that parents are going to rise up just like they did in the US and say, this is our right, this is our duty, we are going to home educate our kids. And then that, like here in the US, society has followed kind of slowly, but now homeschooling is acceptable. Everyone knows someone who homeschools. I can see that trajectory coming along in a few years in countries in Latin America, and I
Definitely.
think that's going to be pretty exciting.
Definitely, it is. We're looking forward to seeing what God does in our countries. And thank you again for this time, Darren. We hope to have you back again to share more about groups and updates of what's happening around the country. And once again, people, help us spread the word. Join HSLDA, learn about what they do. They don't only do advocacy for homeschooling, you also have a learning platform, so you can take classes with HSLDA. You have other programs that maybe we can mention it in another podcast, but we are very thankful to know you, and thank you for supporting the Hispanic community. Darren, please let everybody know, and we'll see you soon.